Today I would like to discuss a topic with you that should be of your interest as an upcoming writer or an established writer, and that's the idea of how to come up with story ideas. In this video I will try and focus on how you can come up with story ideas for short stories, but I think the same ideas should apply for novels as well. And I think the core piece of what we are actually doing in writing, or what writing revolves around, is conflict. So I think that's the prerequisite to get a story idea, is thinking about a conflict. So now, how do we find conflict? I think a way to approach this question is thinking about what you want as a human being. Think about the stuff that you want to accomplish, maybe material things that you would like to possess. All of that is relevant when it comes to thinking about conflict, because what you also need to do is think about what do you not want in life. So for example, you don't want to suffer from an illness, you don't want to go blind or lose a hand, or you don't want, the job that you're working on not making any sense. There's, I think, a lot you can think about, and if you don't have an idea of what you want from life or what you don't want from life, think about examples of other people. What do you think other people want from life? What do you think they are trying to avoid? And by combining those two things, combining what people want and what people want to avoid, you can create conflict. So for example, you could say that there's a character who wants to be a writer. That's something I guess people want to do. Now, what is something that people would like to avoid? They don't want to suffer from an illness. They don't want to go blind, for example. Now, you created a conflict by introducing the want to be a writer, but being blind. So that's the first conflict that you can think about. For a short story, you need at least 2 conflicts to get your story going. So again, think about what you want. Maybe I want a nice house. I want to, for example, live on a chateau. And think about something that people want to avoid. I want to avoid being locked up in a cellar, for example. Now you have 2 conflicts, and those 2 conflicts would make up, as I would call it, the setup of your story. Now, an important thing before you can start thinking about your story is how do those 2 conflicts relate to each other? You somehow need to find a connection between those 2 conflicts, because if you have separate conflicts and you're basically trying to explain separate or tell separate stories, but of course we want to tell one story, one short story. Now, what could be the connection between those examples? We have the blind writer who owns a chateau and is locked up in a cellar. Now, you could think about a connection between those 2 conflicts. Maybe their spouse locked them up in a cellar, basically wanting from them to write to ensure the financial means they need. Yeah, you can think about all of this stuff. Maybe another example, you have, for example, someone wants to be a content creator. That's something people want, right? What is something that people want to avoid? They maybe want to avoid producing content or being forced to producing content they don't enjoy. That's the first conflict. A second conflict would be people want children. What people want to avoid, if they could, is of course that their children suffer from a disease. Now you have, again, the setup with 2 conflicts. Now you need to find the relationship between those 2 conflicts. For example, the content creator who doesn't like his job because he's forced to produce content he doesn't enjoy is actually doing that to afford the medicine for that child. Now we have the setup and we have the connection between the conflicts we thought about. Then the next step after finding the setup is you need to put the story in motion. And how do we bring the story in motion? I think there's two aspects you need to think about. Characters can be set into motion from an internal perspective, but also from an external perspective. I think that's the difference between like character-driven and plot-driven stories. For example, setting someone into motion from an internal perspective could be that they decide to do something. They make the decision to change their circumstances, for example. An external factor could be someone else does something, so they have to act in a certain way. So there's internal and external motivation. But again, I think it comes down to setting your character in motion, wherever it comes from. For example, in the example of the content creator and his child who suffers, unfortunately, from a disease, there could be the factor that the main character notices that the doctor he's been consulting with to treat the disease is actually not providing the correct medicine, is actually like an imposter. So this is an example of something external having an influence on our main character. To give an example about something internal, we return to the blind author who's locked up in a cellar. You set this character in motion because he wants to get out of this situation. He decides to get out of that cellar. And again, don't judge me on those story ideas. I think you can come up with better stuff. Now we created the setup and we set the characters in motion via internal factors or external factors. So now what is setting a character into motion is basically they want to change their current circumstance. And then again, we can think about what do they want in that specific situation. For example, the content creator who just noted that the doctor is not treating his child in a correct way could maybe confront their doctor. Or the blind author locked up in a cellar could, start to escape. But what you need to know is that, of course, they have something they want and they act upon it, but also you need to introduce something that they don't want. Because it's boring to just let the characters do whatever they please and just reach whatever goal they have, there needs to be some kind of feedback or pushback from reality. Because that's life, right? There's nothing going as planned. There's always some kind of pushback. There's always some asterisks. So that's what we want to replicate within the story. So if you think about like confronting the content creator, confronting the doctor, there's also something he doesn't want. Or the author trying to escape from the basement, there's also something that happens he doesn't want. Maybe he learns that actually he isn't the writer, that their spouse was locking up them in the cellar because they were imagining being an author and they just want to remove them from their life. Now what you do, you have the setup, you set your character in motion, and then you can repeat this until you feel comfortable that you reach a point to find a conclusion. So you move the character either by internal decision or an external influence from stage to stage. Now at the point where you thought about that, you need to find an ending. How do you find an ending? You don't find an ending by just letting the character reach his goal. Again, we always have a certain amount of pushback. There's nothing only positive or only negative. You don't let your characters die and that's the end of the story. There needs to be a combination between positive and negative. Also, at the end of your story, you can't really introduce any new aspects to the story. So for example, the author escaped the cellar, did something else that you decide, and then he decides to go on a cruise. That's the end. That completely doesn't make sense. That's something completely new that wasn't mentioned previously in the story. It needs to somehow align to the previous steps. Maybe to the setup or something that you learned throughout the story that you can go back to. Maybe, well, at the end of the story, he decides to return into the cellar because he feels so disillusioned about his previous identity that there's no other world he knows than returning to the cellar. So you can think about multiple examples. So we have the setup, we set our character in motion, and when we need to find the ending, when we are trying to reach the ending, our character has a specific goal, doesn't reach their goal because there's always pushback, and then at the end of the story remains in an equilibrium between positive and negative. That's how you find an ending. Let me know if you find these ideas too abstract. I think the whole thing that you need to worry about is conflict. I provided you with some ideas on how to find conflict. There's multiple others, and you can just think about a random conflict. Maybe some of this stuff can be intuitive, of course. If you struggle to find story ideas, I think it's well worth thinking about what people want, what do they not want. Because then you always have a conflict, and with at least 2 conflicts, I think you can start a story and tell the story. I actually thought about these examples that I just provided to you while thinking about what I can talk about today. And I came up with them in 15 minutes or so. So I don't expect you to think that this is like the ultimate story, but I'm happy to see if you have if you take any inspiration from that and maybe come up with short story ideas. I would love to hear your feedback on those, and I'm also looking forward to finishing my first novel and then being able again to start writing short stories again. Maybe I'll pick up the story of the blind author locked up in a cellar. Maybe that's a good story idea to actually publish that in an anthology or send that into a call for submission. I think that's the exciting part. And maybe as a challenge, what you could do is you can set yourself the goal that each day you think about a new conflict that you can come up with, and then let your mind wander on how the story can proceed. How do you set your characters in motion? What do they want at this stage of the story? What is the pushback they receive? And then also the most important aspect of all of that is finding an ending that both has positive and negative connotation somehow. Because again, I think it's boring if you just end on a positive note or on a negative note. All right, I hope you have a great rest of your day and see you tomorrow in my next video. Thanks.